Hi, everyone. Let's do it. Welcome, allies in the housing and racial justice movement. Today's presentation is in conversation with Shift the Bay, our regional initiative to advance research-driven and field practice strategies that drive new narratives for the housing and racial justice movement in the Bay Area. My name is Madison, and I'm the narrative specialist at NPH, Shift the Bay's proud anchor org. And you can learn more about the initiative, its resources, newsletter, events, and to join our Slack community on shiftthebay.org. So in 2001, EMC helped us to power the robust research that shaped Shift the Bay's approach to our regional narrative strategy, including our core resource, the Shift the Bay Playbook, or Shift the Narrative Playbook. And now they're back to continuing measuring the values influencing narrative shift and identifying which policies and messages are resonating with Bay Area residents. This polling data is super crucial to track the impacts of our narrative strategy over time and make sure we're responsive to voters and adapting to broader changes in the affordable housing movement. So I'm super stoked to welcome our partners at EMC Research, Emily Kirby-Goodman and Ruth Bernstein. Please say hello in the chat and tell us where you're coming from and what you're excited to learn about today. With that, I will pass it to y'all to get us going. Hey there, welcome.
Thank you, Madison, and hi, everyone. Ruth and I are seeing a lot of familiar names in the attendee list, and we're happy to be with you all this afternoon. We're just going to get right to it. We have a lot to cover. Ruth will keep an eye on the Q&A portion as we get through this, and feel free to throw reflections or questions in the chat as well. We will have some time at the end of the presentation to cover anything that we haven't done virtually. But as Madison sort of started us off, we have conducted an annual survey. This is our third year doing this. You may have tuned in for previous presentations in years past, where we really try to understand where Bay Area voters are in their attitudes around housing and racial justice. And this year we included a couple new questions about their attitudes around homelessness. So we're excited to report the data from this year's poll and show you how things have changed or not since past years. So quick note on methodology to just kind of ground us and better understand where this data is coming from. We conducted a survey of registered voters in the 9-county Bay Area. This was fully online. We contacted voters by email. They had an email available on the voter file. The data comes from late May, early June, which is roughly the same time that we have conducted this poll back in 2021 and in 2020. So we'll show you that. We can kind of assume that even though there's a lot going on in the world, we have tried to keep the timing of this poll pretty consistent over the last few years, so we can see how attitudes have shifted. We have a total of about 1,400 interviews. We conducted some additional interviews among BIPOC voters this year. That was a priority coming out of the research from last year. So when we report on some of these findings, we feel confident in kind of the smaller sample sizes from previous years. We increase that to have more reliable analysis in some of those subgroups, important subpopulations. We did offer the survey in English, Spanish, and Chinese. So we're going to first go through a few overall key findings, kind of mood of the Bay Area, get into the values, the housing and homelessness and racial justice values. And then we're going to show you some policy elements that we tested, and again, show you how attitudes have shifted or not over time. And then we'll kind of show you some more demographic information toward the end. So very big picture on the overall mood of the electorate. For anyone who has tuned in to any polling presentation from really anyone over the last couple of years, you will have noted that folks are feeling pretty cranky. We see that pessimism among the Bay Area electorate is quite high. Some of this, we saw a little bit of an increase in optimism while we were all, flattening the curve in those early days of 2020. But this has really returned to what we saw kind of pre-COVID, things that were brewing around just kind of more negative sentiment among voters throughout the Bay Area. We see that homelessness and housing related issues continue to be top of mind concern for voters. We have an open-ended question where we ask them what's on their mind, and these things really rise to the top. We have a few questions about the economic climate, and we see that voters are feeling pretty grim about where the economy is headed. In terms of their personal housing situation, pretty consistent with what we have seen in past research. A lot of folks kind of reporting there's no major change for them in their personal housing situation. We've seen a little bit of an increase who say that their situation has become more unstable in the last year. Looking at some key findings among the housing value frames, and we're really going to dig into these, but just very big picture. We see that the attitudes of Bay Area voters on housing values. So we'll kind of explain this in more detail, but we have a number of kind of contrasting statements where we intentionally pick polarizing statements on either end of a scale or a spectrum, and we say, where are you? And when we look at these value statements, we see incredible consistency, very little change in where voters place themselves on that scale on housing, homelessness, racial justice, value frames than what we have seen in last year in 2021 and then also in 2020. We see that voters really do feel that housing is a human right. Folks should have access to housing. They're fundamentally supportive of housing, even in their neighborhood, and it's a community responsibility. And they think that housing policy can make a difference to control the cost of housing. So that's kind of the good parts on where voters stand on more progressive stances when it comes to housing. We see more mixed attitudes when it comes to the impact of structural racism on the housing crisis. So do you prefer a mix of homeowners and renters in your neighborhood? We see kind of folks putting themselves in the middle of that spectrum. And then where we see more conservative attitudes continue to be around reparations, which we will show you how those attitudes are pretty consistent with the past. And when we started to introduce new value statements around homelessness, we see that folks are feeling kind of more leaning toward elements that include kind of more conservative positions. They acknowledge that homelessness is a structural problem, but they're really putting a lot of the blame on homelessness on individual kind of circumstances as well, which of course sounds like a total contradiction. And we'll get into all of that. And then lastly, big picture on the policy element. So we had a few, a dozen or so policies that we tested. You support or oppose X, Y, or Z. We asked about the 3 Ps. We continue to see very high support for policies that support the 3 Ps. And we'll show you again kind of where some other new policy ideas come up, but we see pretty strong support for a variety of policy ideas facing the Bay Area. So getting into the general mood, we see today 55% of the electorate says that things are headed down the wrong track, compared to 30% who say that things are headed in the right direction. I noted in 2020, we had a little bit of bump in optimism when it was very COVID specific. We were doing our part. California and the Bay Area looked pretty good. That was temporary because now things are kind of returning to where they were before the pandemic started. So back in 2019, you can note 57% saying that things were headed down the wrong track, which is roughly where we are today. Looking at the most important problems. So this was an open-ended question. What do you think are the most important problems facing the Bay Area today? They could say one thing, they could say 5 things. We recorded everything that they said and then categorized all of those responses into similar themes. So what you're seeing here isn't the specific words necessarily that people used, but the thematic categories. So on the far left, you can see homelessness. The scale there, just as a reference, the lighter red is the earlier polls, the darkest red is the current data. So homelessness, 50% mentioning something about homelessness being one of their most important problems today, which is pretty consistent with where we have seen it relative to other issues in previous research. Housing, affordable housing, housing crisis, something in that In that category, we see also very high mentions of that. And then a pretty big increase in crime, guns, public safety. I think we've seen this in other polling. Just perceptions of crime have really increased in the last couple of years. So that's really coming out in terms of what is top of mind for voters as well. 37% of voters mentioning that as one of their top problems, up from 23% last year and only 10% back in 2020. We also see cost of living has almost doubled or not the cost of living, but those who mention that cost of living is a problem in the Bay Area has doubled in the last year. It was pretty consistent between 2020 and 2021, but we're really seeing an increase now in people mentioning that as a top problem facing the Bay Area. Of course, it makes sense when you think of gas prices, inflation, and all of that, which is pretty real for folks. And then the other items mentioned here, we're not really seeing much of a difference in how folks are reporting climate change, environment, wildfires. Maybe give it a couple of months. We'll see how this season goes. Traffic and congestion continues to be kind of lower in top of mind concern. And then, of course, COVID has dropped off pretty substantially in the last couple of years. On economic conditions, somewhat volatile if we look at just the last few years. So we see that perceptions of the current economic conditions are slightly more positive than it was at the beginning of COVID or the pandemic, but now they're kind of more pessimistic. So in 2021, we saw things were kind of, oh, maybe they're not so bad. But now we're really looking at, 59% of people are saying that the economy compared to 6 months ago is worse, and half are saying that the economy 6 months from now will be worse. So the outlook does not look good when it comes to voter perception of where the economy is headed. On the ease of finding housing, so the little gray box is the question that was asked, thinking about housing in the Bay Area compared to a year ago. Is it easier or harder to find a place to live, or is about the same? And we see that 65% of voters say that it's harder to find an affordable place to live a place to live. We didn't even say affordable place to live in the Bay Area today, compared to only 4% that say that it's gotten easier, and 31% who say that it's about the same. So an increase in the amount, in the frequency of people who have said that it's gotten harder, and a decrease in the percent of people who say that it's gotten easier. So you can see that the spread is a little bit starker than it was in previous research. Thinking about your own housing situation compared to a year ago, is it more stable or less stable? We see just a slight increase in the percent of voters who are saying that their housing situation is less stable, 23% now compared to 19% back in 2020 and in 2021. And the more stable has really remained pretty consistent. Wanted to show you this housing stability question among homeowners versus renters. And you can see that the self-reported housing stability is a bit higher. I guess housing instability is higher among renters. So among renters in the Bay Area, we see 34% report that their housing situation has become less stable in the last year. Only 12% of homeowners say that their housing situation has become less stable in the last year. So this is a question that we have asked in our Shift the Narrative research. We've also asked it in other research that we've done throughout the Bay Area. It's one that, I think the media reports on a bit. Are you going to leave the Bay Area in the next few years? Despite everything going on, all of, the mentions of the problems and things facing the complexities of living here, we see, it's basically the same as it's been. About 45% saying that they agree with that, 42% saying that they disagree. The net agree, when you take into consideration, the margin of error is not significant. So we see pretty consistent numbers kind of back to where they have always been in other research that we have done. We don't see a lot of significant movement here with people reporting that they're going to leave the Bay Area. Looking at housing concerns, we've got these, do you agree or disagree that you're concerned about finding an affordable place to live for yourself and then concerned about low income and disadvantaged families being able to find a place to live. We see incredibly consistent numbers here as well. The agreement or the concern about self is, a roughly half of voters, just over, but we see pretty overwhelming concern about housing for low income and disadvantaged families being able to find an affordable place to live. Okay, moving into the housing value frame. So we asked, as I mentioned at the top of the presentation, this survey was designed online because we wanted to give people kind of an ability to put themselves in wherever they are on two different opposing statements. So we'll show you the full text of the two kind of contrast statements here in a second. But as we go through this, we also wanted to show you how we are just calling these in the shorthand so that when we refer to them later on these value frames, this is kind of our glossary. So human right, YIMBY, all of the words in bold reference a value statement, and we're referencing kind of the more progressive stance. So for example, having a decent place to live is a basic human right. Later, we'll refer to that value statement as human rights. So we might jump back to this slide just to remember what was that exact language that we tested. So what you see here is the full text of all of the value frames. We're going to look at them in more detail, but just so that you can get kind of an overall snapshot of where the electorate is when it comes to these housing value frames. So participants or respondents in the survey did not actually see the numbers associated. We have assigned those for the sake of our analysis so we could look at a number, an average score. So this mean score is telling you the higher the number, so higher, closer to 100, the more progressive stance that they have. The lower the number, closer to 0, the lower the mean score, that's kind of a more conservative viewpoint or value statement. So respondents had a little kind of ticker thing, if you can imagine. They saw the two statements on either end, and we said, put your dot or your arrow anywhere where you perceive yourself to be, which opinion comes closer to your point of view. So the ones in blue are a mean score of above 50, meaning more progressive stance than not on the value frames. So the top ones here, having a decent place to live is a basic human right. The opposing statement to that was having a decent place to live is a privilege, not a right. And we see a mean score of about 65.5 on that statement. I support building more housing, even in my neighborhood. We see about the same mean score there, 65. When it comes to housing, we should act as a community and make sure that everyone has a roof over their head versus we should prioritize what's best for ourselves and our family. We see about 59, a mean score of 59. Housing policy can make a significant difference and help to control the cost of housing regardless of the economy versus housing policy doesn't really make a difference and it's tied to the cost of housing is tied to the economy. We see a mean score of 57. Like public education and healthcare, everyone should have access to housing over everyone should work to secure housing that they can afford. We see a mean score of about just under 55. So you can see that things are starting to get more toward the middle, meaning more people are placing themselves kind of in the middle of those two statements when presented with both. I prefer a mix. Homelessness is a result of broken housing and economic systems versus homelessness is a result of personal choices and challenging individual circumstances. So this was a new question. We'll show you the trend data on all the ones that we have it for, but calling out the homelessness questions were new this year. So interesting to see where folks are on these, especially. That's a mean score of 54, so just over kind of the middle of the road. I prefer a mix of renters and homeowners in my neighborhood versus I prefer primarily homeowners. We see a mean score of 52, so just on the other side of the 50 mark. Structural racism has directly contributed to our housing crisis versus inequalities in housing are separate from structural racism, kind of again, right in the middle. Housing policy should be focused on an area's future needs versus protect home values for an area's existing residents. We see right smack in the middle. We cannot remove homeless encampments unless people have safe, stable housing options nearby to move into. versus we must enforce our laws, remove homeless encampments, and keep our streets clean. We see folks gravitating closer to the more conservative position on that one. So a lower mean score, under 50. It's just under 47. The Bay Area is too crowded, not enough space. We see about a mean score of 47. The flip side of that was there is enough space for everyone who wants to live here. So people are perceiving that the Bay Area is too crowded. Some people choose to live on the streets or in encampments, even when housing is available. We hear this narrative come up a lot in some of the qualitative research that we do around this. And then no one chooses to be homeless. There's just not enough housing available. We see a mean score of about 45. Everyone should have to live where they can afford versus wherever they want. We see more folks saying that you should have to live where you can afford. Past discrimination against people of color should not affect how people are treated today, versus we need policy that makes up for decades of unfair treatment against people of color. We see a lower mean score below 50 at 41. And then people are driven into homelessness because of mental illness and substance abuse, or people who experience homelessness are driven into mental illness and substance abuse. We see a pretty low mean score on that, meaning more folks people are driven into homelessness because of mental illness and substance abuse, a mean score of 36.5. I do not trust my local government officials to pass laws and make decisions that are best for my community. This is where we see the lowest mean score of all at 29. On the other side of that was, I trust my local government. So trust in local government is low. When we look at how these value frames have shifted over time, there has been very little shift in attitudes on all of the items that we have to compare to. So just to give you perspective, we saw, we saw about a point difference between the 2020 poll and now. Between last year and this year, it's even smaller. It's less than a point. So we see very consistent numbers. And that's when we average all of the statements together. We look at where is there a shift. Of course, there are a couple that shifted a point or two, a couple that didn't in both directions. So we kind of look at what that means. On the top line level, we're just seeing very little change in attitudes. And you can see the darker the blue, the more recent the poll, and the darker the red, the more recent the poll. So again, we're looking at the dark blue as the current data, the dark red is the current data, and down the line on almost all of these value statements, you can see very little difference in attitudes compared to previous years. This is kind of a cool way of looking at all of the value statements again as a snapshot. What this is showing us is little histograms for each of these. And again, they're using the kind of shorthand name. So that human right one, having a decent place to live is a basic human right. What this is showing us is how the attitudes are distributed across that scale. So where do attitudes kind of fall in the more extremes, where you get kind of more of the half pipe look? For example, access to housing, the second one down from the far left. Structural racism, again, you see more of a half pipe. People are gravitating toward more extreme positions. The one where we saw housing is a human right, we see a lot of folks, it looks more like a mountain. We see a lot of folks gravitating toward a more progressive stance that having a decent place to live is a basic human right. The almost opposite of that down at the bottom right is the trust in government. So you see those mean scores, those were essential opposites. Very high mean score for housing is a human right, very low mean score for trust in government, because we have a lot of folks gravitating toward the kind of lower mean score in that they do not trust local government to make decisions in their best interest. There are some other value statements that are kind of flat, meaning the distribution of attitudes is pretty even across the board, not a half pipe, not a mountain, just kind of even. There's other ones. I prefer a mix of homeowners and renters in my neighborhood versus I prefer homeowners in my neighborhood. That's the third one down from the far left. That one's interesting because it's like a half pipe with a little bit of a bump in between. And that just means we had a lot of folks who were either kind of definitely in either or camp, but a heavy distribution of people who kind of probably couldn't pick and put themselves like somewhere in the middle. I don't know where I am, so I'm going in the middle. So pretty interesting to see how folks fall out. What this is showing us is the upshot is all of these value statements are correlated with each other. And we're going to get into more correlations and things as we move forward. But what this is telling us is if we can shift attitudes on one of these value statements, we're also shifting attitudes on other values. So for example, if we take, I'm trying to look at the darker the number means that it's a stronger correlation. So we take, for example, human right. If people believe, having a decent place to live is a basic human right, and we can push more people into, a higher mean score on that, or more people think that having a decent place to live is a basic human right, we are also going to be moving the needle on some of these other values. Specifically, we see very strong correlations with the housing as a human right, with the access to housing value, with the people should be able to live where they want, with the housing over encampment. So this just tells us moving forward as we think about how to use these and making sense of them and communicating, when we move one kind of needle, you're also moving another. Getting into a couple of the policy proposals, and then we're going to go back and look at some of demographics here in a minute, but wanted to cover the policy proposal. So we continue to see very high support for policies that support the 3 Ps. So the top two here, protecting tenants and low-income communities from rent gouging. So tenant protections, and then preservation, making sure that current affordable housing continues to stay affordable for those who need it. We see 3/4 of voters are at least somewhat supportive of those two concepts. Protecting tenants and low-income communities from unjust evictions, and building more housing throughout the Bay Area. So we're kind of covering the 3 Ps. We see pretty high support across the board. The intensity, of course, or those who strongly support, drops off a little bit for some of these, but overall, pretty strong support. The second tier things, again, we ask about a corporate tax. This between, we'll show you the potential regional housing bond number here in a second. There's a lot more that goes into what voters actually see. So these should be considered more conceptual and not actual policies as though it were on the ballot, but it gives us a good sense of, where voters are very generally when it comes to these policies. So increasing taxes on large corporations in California with high profits to pay for great things, housing for those who need it. We see 61% of voters are supportive of that, including 39% who say that they strongly support that policy. Protecting the right of local communities to change their zoning laws to allow duplexes and fourplexes in single family neighborhoods. We know this is a kind of a local battle that's happening all over the Bay Area in different cities. So again, it's really community or city specific or area specific, but very broadly speaking, when we talk about, protecting the rights of local government, when it comes to zoning, we see 53% of voters are supportive of that. Affordable housing in your community being driven and run by mission-driven nonprofit organizations versus tenant organizations. This was a new ad this year. Wanted to see, do voters perceive differences in that? We see a little bit higher support for housing that's built and run by nonprofit organizations, but not hugely significant. And then just showing you how the support has been pretty consistent. We have the, kind of this simplified production policy, very consistent support. We see preservation, again, very consistent. And then the bond, which we didn't word exactly how it would be on the ballot as I caveated, but passing a $10 billion Bay Area general obligation bond to support housing that's affordable. We see very consistent numbers there again, 57%. So kind of above a majority, shy of 2/3, a lot more to unpack there, but pretty consistent with where we've seen it. So the next few slides are really just intended to show again how the value statements are correlated with the policy proposals. So this one is kind of it is so top of mind and obvious, like you hold a YIMBY value, you're willing to hold a statement or hold a value that is I support housing in my backyard versus support a policy that is, I support building more housing throughout the Bay Area, we see very strongly correlated. So this one is sort of just the obvious one to kind of wrap your head around how this correlation is working. We really wanted to run these to understand what are the values that are driving policy support for the 3 Ps. And so, of course, if you hold a YIMBY value or you value YIMBY, then you're obviously more on board with production, right? When it comes to protection, so from evictions, rent gouging, we'll show you in a second, you can see the red box is essentially the cheat sheet. So we see the highest correlation or the strongest correlation with the value statements that are in red or boxed in red. So housing is a community responsibility, having a decent place to live is a human right, homelessness is the result of broken economic systems. Those value statements are strongly correlated with willingness to support protection policy. So protecting tenants from low-income communities and rent gouging. When it comes to, unjust evictions, now rent gouging, you can see some of the same ones: human right, access to housing, housing over encampments, community responsibility, broken economic systems. So some consistencies there. Interesting, the preservation, making sure current affordable housing continues to stay affordable. We see a little bit different ones, some of the same, but picked up a few different ones. For example, structural racism, which we actually saw as a value on the top line, a lower mean score for that. But when it comes to preservation policy, we see it strongly correlated with willingness to support. And then when it comes to the bond, again, some of the same, but some different. And it's interesting to see how they're ranked. So community responsibility, very strongly correlated. Having that value is very strongly correlated with your willingness to support the bond. Access to housing, human right, we saw some of those. Reparations, again, we saw a lower mean score for that. But when it comes to supporting the bond, we actually see holding that value, you're kind of more willing to support the bond. So another new question that we added this year, and kind of the theme of unpacking some of the attitudes around homelessness, we asked essentially a forced choice. It was a ranking question. So again, this was online, so it allowed people to kind of more creatively rank what we asked them to. So here are some ideas for what could be done to address homelessness in the Bay Area. Put them in order of the things that you think will actually make a difference. And what we see here in the purple bar is the percent that put that particular item as the very first thing, top of the list. What you're seeing in green is that item was listed as one of their top 3. So there's a theme here that you'll continue to see, but prevention programs, tailored care, and permanent housing on site that includes supportive services are really the things that are coming to the top, both in terms of first choice, like putting that as their number 1, but also on their top 3. The job training and employment opportunities is also coming to the top if we were to consider this like top 4. Some of the more specific elements like unrestricted cash assistance, emergency shelters, crisis response, they were important to some people or ranked by some people as a top choice, but not nearly as many as are ranking those kind of prevention, tailored care, permanent supportive housing, job training. So we took our data and essentially segmented the respondents into different buckets based on demographics and their attitudes. And we thought this was sort of a more useful or creative way to think about the Bay Area electorate and how we can understand them better when it comes to their values and their demographics. So these 6 buckets include millennial, urbanite professionals. They all have kind of cute names. These are folks who we're kind of perceiving as a bit younger. They're living in cities. They're a bit more progressive, and they're kind of on board with housing initiatives. The housing justice beneficiaries are folks who are younger. They're lower to middle income. A lot of them are renters. None of this is exact necessarily, but we're trying to look at kind of broad themes here. They are not very good voters, so they're not showing up to vote in every single election, but they are generally progressive when it comes to housing policies and attitudes. Democratic suburban elites, these are older folks, kind of Dem establishment voters. They are voting, they're very engaged. They're mostly on board with housing policies. Diverse pragmatists are folks that are unengaged. They're not really voting very often, or they're just infrequent voters. They're generally supportive, but they're really kind of more concerned about housing for themselves than housing for others. And we're going to dig into them because I'm going to flag the diverse pragmatists and the next group, the status quo homeowners, as potential kind of middle of the road groupings when we think about the Bay Area electorate. Status quo homeowners, these are kind of diverse, disengaged folks, conservative homeowners. They're not really caring so much about housing issues, but they're also not opposed, like the green box here that you can basically put Clint Eastwood face on and imagine exactly who a Republican obstructionist is. Older, very engaged Republicans, kind of the get off my lawn folks. The status quo homeowners, they're a little more gettable because they're kind of open to housing policy. They're not quite in that Republican obstructionist. So we're going to focus a little bit more in the coming slides here on those diverse pragmatists and the status quo homeowners. So we wanted to show you the housing values by some of these groupings because it's pretty interesting to look at. The dark gray is where the electorate is overall, which you have seen and we've shown you. So human right and YIMBY, we saw kind of right there as the mean score of 65. The millennial urbanite professionals, who we said were, kind of mostly white, living in the city, higher income, you can kind of picture it. They have pretty progressive attitudes when it comes to housing. So they're the bright green. Their mean score is basically off the charts. Certainly higher than the overall on basically everything. Homeless, substance abuse item, and trust in government, they have a higher mean score than the overall, but those are the only two that they are below a mean score of 50. So you can imagine these millennial urbanites are basically kind of with us when it comes to progressive stances on housing values. The housing justice beneficiaries, pretty similar trends here. There are a few there at the bottom where there are more of them where they're at least in the middle or below 50. But for the most part, they're outperforming that overall value number. The Democratic suburban elites, a few here where they're outperforming. So human right, a mean score of 71. We see community responsibility. So these are ranked in order of those who had the highest mean score. So in most cases, we saw that the YIMBY, I support housing in my backyard, was the second highest mean score. For these folks, it's kind of tied with that, and housing is a community responsibility versus an individual one. So you can sort of start to picture who these folks are and how and why they have the values that they do. The diverse pragmatists we see kind of looking a lot like the electorate as a whole, with some exceptions, not so trusting in government, drawing your attention to the very bottom there, where they actually have a lower mean score that will continue to get lower as we look through the next couple of groups. But important to realize that when we think about, this group of the electorate, they're disengaged, they might be open, they're really valuing housing for themselves because they're kind of just trying to get by. It's helpful to know they're basically look like the electorate when it comes to some of these fundamentals. Housing is a human right. It's a community responsibility. I support housing. They're probably thinking, yeah, housing in my backyard sounds great. I could live there. The status quo homeowners we see start to peel off and look a bit different than the overall because they have more conservative values, which of course makes sense. They're not off the charts like the next slide you'll see of the Republican obstructionists. So there's some fuzziness and openness here. With the Republican obstructionists, they are below 50 on every single item. So again, we grouped these because of their attitudes, their demographics, but they also help us kind of better understand the electorate as a whole in terms of, how folks are kind of in these different buckets and what does that mean for housing policy and actually communicating and moving forward. This is the housing policy slide by persona. So if you remember, we had 9 policy proposals. We probably didn't count them, but we had 9. So we took all of them and we said, okay, if you support 9 out of 9, you're a dark blue on this slide. If you supported none of the housing policies, you're a red. So light blue means you're supporting, at least 6 of the 8, 3 to 5, and so on. So if you pay attention to the blue here, you can see the folks that we identified as kind of the more gung-ho housing folks, the millennial urbanite professionals and the housing justice beneficiaries. There's a lot of blue. They're supporting most of them were supporting at least 6 of the 9 policy proposals, and a lot of them were supporting every single housing policy proposal that we presented. If you look at the bottom 2, the status quo homeowners and the Republican obstructionists, you can see that those folks, we see a lot lower support for some of the housing policy proposals. And then the 2 groups in the middle that we sort of identified that we wanted to dig into a little bit more about potential openness. Some of them more engaged in the case of democratic suburban elites, some of them less engaged in the case of diverse pragmatists. They're not overwhelmingly supportive of these housing policy proposals, but there's still a lot of blue and there's not a lot of red, meaning they're not opposed to them. They're just kind of like not really top of mind. So these groups, the democratic suburban elites and the diverse pragmatists, really look to us as potential kind of soft middle ground to better understand when it comes to, passing a regional housing bond or developing housing policies in a local area and things like that. So just a snapshot or 2 on these 2 kind of main groups that we wanted to highlight for you. So this is looking at the democratic suburban elites. So we kind of looked very broadly at what their policy proposal support was, but you can see the specifics here. Generally on board with protecting renters from rent gouging, preserving housing that's affordable, protecting tenants from eviction, a corporate tax. They're pretty on board. They are not very concerned about housing for themselves. So I'm looking at the bubble on the right. 26% say that they're concerned about finding an affordable place to live for themselves. 89% say that they are concerned about low income and disadvantaged families being able to find a place to live. So really, really, really worried about others and generally supportive of some of these housing policies, not really worried about housing for themselves. We think, well, this seems like a prime group to really solidify some of their support because they're basically willing. They're just, it's not really front and center. Homelessness policy preferences is the bottom right there. This was that question where we asked folks to rank. You can see prevention programs, tailored care, and permanent housing were the top 3 among these democratic suburban elites. The diverse pragmatists look a bit different, as we saw from the housing values slide, but they also look a bit different when it comes to policy support. So a lot more on board with some of these policy proposals like preservation, protection from rent gouging. We see general high support. And then on the housing concerns, which is the real difference here, pretty high concern for housing for themselves. 65% say that they're concerned. 84% concerned about others. So they're worried about themselves and worried about others. And then when it comes to homelessness, they really see prevention programs, tailored care, and job training as their top 3 about what could be done to address homelessness. So going to wrap up here with just a few notes, and then we can pop over to the Q&A or the chat, or would love to hear your reflections as well. We see that Bay Area voters' housing values continue to be very consistent despite the volatility of the environment around us. Starting back in 2020, when we did this poll in May of 2020, it was COVID, George Floyd, there was a lot going on. So we fast forward a year later, very consistent attitudes, and a year later, still very consistent attitudes, which is very helpful for us to understand and know going forward as we start to develop various policies and programs and start to think about solutions. Attitudes around homelessness are kind of more conservative narratives. Homelessness, we know this, very tricky. I know there's a lot of folks on the phone, would love to hear your thoughts on this as well. A lot to unpack there, but of course, we're seeing kind of very mixed attitudes and kind of frustration around what's happening, what's not happening, but willingness to want to do something about it. We see general support for housing policies that support the 3 Ps. And again, we see the very strong correlation between some of those housing values and willingness to support. And like I showed you on that kind of pyramid looking slide, we shift attitudes on one metric, you're going to shift on another. So that's just to say there's a lot of bang for your buck, so to speak, on some of this. And then, we really hope that this data continues to lay the groundwork for understanding and mobilizing and working toward future efforts. Speaking specifically about a potential bond measure in 2024, but there's a lot out there, a lot of great stuff that y'all are working on. So hopefully this data can come in handy for some of those efforts. All right, happy to take questions. I'll stop the share for a sec, but can pop up any slides as it's helpful. I just want to be able to look at some of the Q&A that's come back and forth. So one, I see Dawn, you asked, can you say more about who is surveyed as a voter? So we use the voter file. So if they're a registered voter in the Bay Area, they had a chance of getting into our random sample. We looked at the 9 counties. We did this survey by email. So email address attached to voters on the voter file. We sent out a random sample of emails and asked folks to take it either on their computer or their phone that way. So this comes from voters from the voter file. I think that was the only open question, but happy to lift up anything, either Madison that you see or anyone else. I don't know exactly how the unmuting of yourself works, if that's possible. So throw it in the chat if you can't unmute.
I'm not sure if they can unmute, but there was a question just about understanding the value statements and how you pose them. So if you just want to clarify that, that'd be great.
Sure. Oh, okay. Thank you. So I'll pull up one slide that can hopefully better show you this, Ariel. What respondents saw was essentially just a screen in front of them. So we're showing them all here together, which is kind of overwhelming, but each person on the screen only saw one of these at a time. So you can imagine if we just take this top one here, having a decent place to live is a privilege, not a right. They saw that sentence on the left side of their screen. They saw having a decent place to live is a basic human right on the other side of their screen. They had a little ticker box. They were able to put themselves wherever they wanted in that box. So what we're referring to when we say value frames or value statements are these. So where were people on the value frames? Where was a voter or respondent on the value frame? Having a decent place to live is a basic human right. What was their mean score on that? I hope that helped. Oh, there you go. All right, join late. We're talking about this. Forced choice question for a bunch of different value frames. And then we kind of talked through more detail about each of these. And then maybe I think some folks were asking about it will be shared. If you haven't seen that, Madison said, yes, absolutely. So, all right, we'll give folks another couple. Okay, is there an urban suburban split? Great question. The demographics that we showed you with those kind of different categories of people, the segmentation accounts for some of that. So for example, when we talk about millennial urbanite, that is a group of voters that is more urban. The status quo homeowners, those tend to be more suburban. We don't have like the specific breakdown of everything by urban and suburban. That's something we could probably look into, but wasn't covered here in the explicit sense. It was covered in kind of those more creative breakdowns of the segmentations of the electorate. Okay, I see a few others. Justine, other polling work about context for the lack of trust in local government. Is it specific to housing? No, it's not. We're seeing it kind of across the board on a variety of things, not specific to housing. Of course, the ripple effect is all kinds of things, you know, libraries, healthcare, housing, COVID. I mean, it's really just across the board, just general sentiment that's crankiness, less willing to support tax measures, all of that somewhat stemmed from just a general lack of trust in government, among other things, external factors, cost of living, things like that, that isn't necessarily an elected official's fault, but they'll take the brunt of it. Slide 30, unrestricted cash assistance means something different than UBI guaranteed. The short answer is no. The longer answer is, you know, we didn't know if people necessarily would be familiar with UBI as a term. So we tried to give something that was at least descriptive enough that we weren't using a terminology that folks were not unfamiliar with. But you're right, you know, it could have meant something different, or it could have been ranked differently had we used different language. That was kind of our attempt at the most simplified explanation of what it would mean to just give people money without strings attached. Does this cover only one county, 9? So this is 9-county Bay Area. And did we see any obvious trends of where these 6 voter types were between the 9 Bay Area counties? JT, when we created those groupings, we considered where folks were living. This is kind of related to the urban suburban thing. So it's factored into them when we describe, you know, a Republican obstructionist. We know more of those folks are living in kind of maybe in the kind of eastern part of the Bay Area, like in Contra Costa or Solano. But, you know, there might be some in Marin. It's kind of all over the Bay Area. We considered geography along with other things like age and ethnicity and their values when we created those groupings. Let's see. I think we covered those. Sorry, Madison, if you are seeing something that I'm not, just holler.
Yeah, if you take a look at the chat, Carl's question around messaging.
So we did not cover messaging in this poll. We have in previous polls. I think, you know, Madison, the playbook and other things, I think probably better speaks to messaging around that. So I would lean on you to either answer that or point them in that direction, because we didn't specify, but this kind of helps lay the groundwork for understanding what messaging might work with specific audiences, kind of knowing where the electorate is on some of these values. And then choosing to be homeless figure is pretty staggering. Does your connection between one value proposition and another drive the mental illness leads to homelessness, point or another? I'm not sure I understand. I'll read it again. We need law to enforce laws. Data point is all the value would you say that is linked to? So I'll pull up the correlation slide, which was, I think I referenced it as like a little pyramid. Well, there's actually a couple here that might be worth seeing. Here I am. So these little histograms that we showed that kind of showed the distribution of some of these items. So the one is, you know, homelessness, people who are experiencing homelessness are not choosing homelessness. We see kind of mixed across the board, meaning the distribution is kind of a lower, and then it's like peaks and valleys, if you will. Housing over encampments, a lot of distribution toward the lower end of that, and then a little bit more toward the higher end of that. And when we look at the correlation, so pointing to the two I don't know if my pointer is working, but you can see kind of middle of the road there, homeless / substance abuse. That was the one that was mental illness and substance abuse drives homelessness, or the reverse of that. You can see that that is strongly correlated with, for example, broken economic systems. So if we are moving the needle on, homelessness is the result of broken economic systems, which we actually saw a higher mean score for, when we kind of ratchet that up, we're also moving the needle on kind of the homeless don't choose it, the homeless / substance abuse item. So I think to answer your question is yes, we see a lot of overlap in terms of how these values are driven by each other. And the way we talk about it, is helpful in that we need to understand that when we say homelessness is a result of broken economic system, that resonates with people, but so does people choose to be homeless, which of course is not accurate, but it's what people think, or at least some people. With the question regarding choosing to be homeless, is there data on how long and where the individual was housed? No, the language that you see here was exactly what respondents see. And Nicole, have you looked at the distribution curves on the personas? I wonder if those also give keys to values / messaging. We looked at the distribution. I mean, we have some data on, more kind of sausage on the personas, but the distribution doesn't look as clean as it does if we were to do it, say, for the value frames or the policies or things like that.
Yeah.
Nope.
I would just repeat your answer.
To Nicole's. Sorry. No is the short answer. I think I was more long-winded the first time. But the values are put into how we created them. So people's attitudes are a consideration when we showed you those different categories. I think, though, to your second point about messaging, yes, it would be very helpful to kind of look at what messaging resonates with each of those different buckets. But we don't have that in this poll.
Did you take a look at JT's question, if geographically there are any trends of where the 6 voter types were between the 9 area counties?
Yeah, I think I covered that one. It was a similar question about suburban and urban, in that, the geographic variables were a consideration when we created those. And some of them, it's more obvious, like a millennial urbanite is living in the urban areas, San Francisco, Alameda. But if you look at, the Republican obstructionists, we see, you can sort of suspect where they come from in different parts of the Bay Area. Okay. I think I got to the rest of these. I don't know how to say that I answered it, but I think I covered Justine and Christina, Arlene. I think I got to most of you.
Yeah, I'm seeing all of the questions that we have answered, but we still have plenty of time. So as you're digesting all of this awesome information, please feel free to continue asking away.
Yes, and I can also pull up my contact information and Ruth's. If something comes to you in the middle of the night, like it has a tendency to do with me, feel free to jot it down, send it our way. Obviously, Madison can field some of that as well. Were there any questions around people's understanding of the climate benefits of housing as a way to debunk NIMBY messages? Love that, Zoe. We did not ask any specific questions around that. We had just the policy, very kind of big picture policy around, do you support production, basically was the only thing, but not exactly what you're asking. Sounds awesome though. In terms of persuasion of status quo homeowner, can you draw any conclusions about what might be effective? Again, great question. I'll go to a slide. We didn't test messaging, so I think that more to come on that. But if we look at the status quo homeowners, you know, in general, and there are obviously messaging experts, I don't know if any of them are on the phone, comms people, you're equipped for this, but you know, understanding kind of the role here was to understand who are these people, what are their values, and then to start to generate what might be effective. This poll did not go into that, but you can start to think about, you know, how you might, I don't want to say the word exploit, but how you might tap into some of these more conservative values to really lean into the things that we know they're more progressive on. Like, even though the mean score on focus on an area's future needs is below 50, you know, community responsibility, those two things are, you know, they're middle of the road on that. I think there's an opportunity to kind of meet them where they are on, you know, this is a community responsibility, and they will be more open to that. Housing is a human right. This isn't recommended language necessarily, but when you can understand the values, you can start to think about what might be effective in terms of messaging. And then down the road, we can, of course, test more of that. We had a total of about 1,450, so 1,450. We didn't go through the breakdown of race and ethnicity, but I did say at the top that we conducted an oversample of BIPOC voters this go round. So we would have more reliable sample size when we start to, you know, break down the data that way. Okay. All right. Oh, another one. So we didn't go into, the question is results by county. We didn't go into that, but we've talked a little bit about how the groupings that we showed accounted for geography in that. So that was part one.
I hate to cut anyone off as these questions are trickling in.
Okay, I think we've stayed on top of most of them.
Yeah, is there anything else you want to add or clarify before we close? If no other questions are coming in right now.
I don't think so. I appreciate all of your time and these questions, and there's, you know, clearly more research that can be done. And we're excited to continue digging in and conducting this work. And we think it's been, you know, or we're hoping that it's informative in your future efforts. And hit us up if you think of something.
Awesome. Well, thank you, EMC, for your work to date, and we're stoked to continue working with you to measure the movement. There were a lot of questions around messaging, so I do want to remind you that Shift the Bay is here for all of your narrative needs, and we are coalition driven. So I'd love to add your voice to the mix and connect. I hope we can keep the conversation going. So please come join us on Slack. You can reach our narrative experts there, and as well as your peers working in this space. And you can find the link to join on our website, as well as other Shift the Bay resources, our newsletter sign up, and more resources for you to put this information to work. I'm going to put all of those in the chat right now, and that's it. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you soon.
Thanks all.